the first class, and then I'll post it several times because I know that you can't usually see anything before you've personally joined the room. Hello from Sydney, 1 a.m. in Sydney, Australia. Wow, that is some great dedication. So thank you for coming. Hello from Illinois, Toronto, Canada, Arkansas, Minnesota, Michigan, Maryville, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Carol Traxler from Maryland, um, Mount Prospect, Illinois, Texas, St. Louis, Missouri, Nebraska, San Francisco, Wisconsin. Yes, you are muted. To the person who asked, all only the panelists and the hosts are not. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Oh, okay. Florida, Missouri, Toronto, North Carolina, Montana, Rochester, Michigan, Wisconsin, Sussex, England, Ohio, um, Toronto, Santa Cruz, Texas, Golden, Colorado. Awesome. Well, I'm in American Fork, Utah, Auburn, California, Utah, Oklahoma, La Cruces, New Mexico, Iowa. Oh, someone says they thought it would start at 9 a.m. Eastern time. Um, Sorry for that. Yeah, it's all mountain time. Montpelier. Um, yeah, no need to be sorry. I mean, it's just you were 2 hours early, so better 2 hours early than 2 hours late. Wellington, Florida, Palm Springs, California, Michigan, um, sunny Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, Pacific Grove, California. Awesome. All right. 1 second. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will go ahead and get started now. I'm going to go ahead and post the webinar handout um, real quick, and then whenever anyone asks for it, I'm just going to go ahead and post it again. So, all right, so here's the handout right there. And we're going to go ahead and get started now. So 1 second. Okay, so good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DNA Day, hosted by the Family Search Library in partnership with Roots Tech. My name is Tanner Tolman, and I will be moderating today's presentations. Today, we are going to present 7 classes, and we are glad you could join us. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items. These classes are being live streamed on several platforms, including the Family Searches Library Facebook page and rootstech.org. The recordings for these classes will be available on rootstech.org in the next few days. We have created a wiki page for today's class content, including the handouts for the individual classes. The link for that wiki page will be shared throughout the day in the chat. Our presenters will answer questions at the end of each presentation as time allows. Please post your question in the chat or comment section, and we will pass questions along to the presenter at the end of the class. If you need help with a specific DNA research problem, we encourage you to sign up to meet one-on-one with one of our research specialists in a free 40-minute virtual consultation. Go to the Family Search Library's website at familysearchlibrary.org and click Research Help, and also put a link to that in the chat. If you want to view upcoming webinars taught by the Family Search Library, go to the Family Search Library's Classes and Webinars wiki page, which I'll also provide the link for. And then the recording of this class will be found on our Facebook page initially, and then it will end up on our YouTube and Roots Tech pages. So our first class is going to be Find the Unknown Father in Sweden by Jeff Morris. So I'm just going to give an introduction to Jeff. Jeffrey has been doing Swedish genealogical research for over 35 years. He lived in Sweden for 2 years and then received a bachelor's degree from the University of Utah in philosophy with a minor in Swedish. He has been employed as a Nordic research specialist at the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City for more than 23 years. Among his work assignments, Jeff has helped guests search for their Swedish ancestors, engaged in many archival visits in Sweden, authored hundreds of pages in the Family Search Wiki, and routinely presents at conferences. Jeff is the author of A Practical Guide to Swedish Church Records for Genealogy and Family History, which was published in 2020. So I'll now turn the time over to Jeff.
Thanks, Tanner. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. And all right. Let me switch views here. There we go. All right. I'll get my laser pointer ready as well. Awesome. Hey, I am excited to be here this morning to share my experience with using DNA to find an unknown father in Sweden. In this presentation, you'll be able to use DNA to find an unknown father in Sweden. You'll also be able to just learn from the case study. I realize that there's tons of participants here today who don't have ancestors in Sweden. Nonetheless, this case study will illustrate a lot of key points and show processes in such a way that hopefully will help you to use DNA more effectively. And so I'll finish up then by identifying important tips and key learnings. I'd like to start out by introducing you to my great-grandmother, Augusta Elisabeth Lindqvist, on the left side here. Augusta Elisabeth Lindqvist was born in 1884, and her mother, Anna Erika Eriksdotter, was born in 1859. Now, Sweden is known for having really great records for genealogy. That it's a state church, and so there's a lot of great record stability. And I was able to then, look in lots of records, which I'll talk about later, to try to find an unknown father for Augusta Elisabeth. But we run into some problems because in this time period in Sweden, it's actually if you're born in, for example, 1880s, it's one of the most difficult times to find an unknown father, and I'll share why. But first, let's start out by just looking at talking a bit about records, and then we'll switch over to the DNA process and how we were able to find her father. So, in looking at this map, you can see that there's two different parish churches. One of them is in Bjurholm over here, where one church is, and the other one is Fredrika, which is up here. This green line that you see here is actually a county line. And the places that we start out with to learn about Augusta Elisabeth and her birth story, if you want to say, start out in Bjurholm in a place called Bredträsk. And, you know, to try to find this unknown father had been a major challenge for decades in our family. My mother, who is from Sweden, who was a professional genealogist, would pick it up and then get frustrated and put it down. And she honestly did that, going in records in Bjurholm and following her forward. And it really illustrates that whenever you're using DNA, you have to use records. Like DNA will give you an important piece of evidence to add to the whole hypothesis of what you're trying to prove. But DNA alone is not going to tell the story. You have to have records. So I decided, when first trying to solve this problem, to go back and start looking at the records first and then dive into the DNA process. One of the first things I found was that Augusta Elisabeth has two birth and christening entries. Now, this is kind of unusual, because it's a state church. People are residing in their home village or town. And when they're living there, I mean, why would there be more than one birth, right? In this case, what we see is Augusta Elisabeth down here at the bottom. And we can see the word oäkta right above her name, which means in Swedish, born out of wedlock. This area down here is where the parents' information would be. And the mother is Anna Erika Eriksdotter, and Piga is one of the ways of listing her as an unmarried woman who is working. And then we see some notes over here to the side that say, there was a note sent over from Fredrika, and so different parish. So I thought, oh, I better go look at that one. That gave me the first clue to go look in Fredrika. And when I looked in Fredrika, sure enough, there was another entry here, Augusta Elisabeth. Up here at the top, it shows that there was an emergency christening. So I don't know if the baby was small. They didn't know if it would live long enough to be baptized, and so they did an emergency christening. It lists her over here again, the word oäkta, and then the parental column here has the mother's name, the Piga on the Eriksdotter, and that she's actually living in Stanäs, but Stanäs is a farm over in Bjurholm, not in Fredrika. And interestingly, the part of the record that would normally show the father's name is completely blank. They didn't put in the word okänd, which means unknown. It's blank. And so in this case, it would seem that it was intentional that, the mother didn't want to share the information. And so then we look over at these comments over here on the side. They list the godparents, they list where the godparents are of. And then it also says that a note had been sent over to Bjurholm because that was the official residence of the mother. Let's look at these just a little more closely. This is the part down here that says a note had been sent over to Bjurholm. The parish name of Bjurholm had been abbreviated to the pastor on uh, on the 1st of March, 1884. And then when I looked over the godparents here, there's nothing about who the said to be father is. There's no clues. There's no reference. And so in this case, you're just left with, no name of who the unknown father is. When I looked at the record in Bjurholm, almost identical to the one in Fredrika. The father's name is missing. We have godparents. We have the note had been sent over. We did see that the mother did absolution of sins over in Fredrika. I assume because that's where the birth actually took place. Now, with this information, I was then able to go learn more about the mother. In this time period, the church has actually teamed up with tax authorities. And so uh, having your permanent place of residence recorded in the church records is really important. And in Sweden, they have these things called household records, which are sort of like a census, but they do it every year. Uh, and so, we can actually follow Augusta Elisabeth's mother through 14 household examination records. And then, I then followed Augusta Elisabeth through the household examination records from the time of her birth until the time when she and her mother decide to move, and then right up until when Augusta Elisabeth marries. So I looked at all 14, carefully analyzed everything I could see to follow her year to year, all the way up until when she married. I even looked at the moving records. Um, in this case, when Augusta or Anna Erika Eriksdottir, mother, moves with her daughter, this is the word daughter here, and they're leaving from Stanäs to another parish called Arnäs, which is almost 70 US miles away. And then when I go look in the Arnäs moving in records, I see that they arrive and that they end up settling down there in Arnäs. So when Augusta Elisabeth shows up on a confirmation record, this it's a Lutheran state church. So when you were about 14 or 15 years old, you would be confirmed. And then once you have been confirmed, then you could participate in communion. And you had to be confirmed to be able to get married. Anyway, when I see the confirmation record over in RNS, this is the first time that I see a surname listed for Augusta Elisabeth, who's born in 1884 out of wedlock. All from the time of her birth up until her confirmation when she's about 14 years old, there's no surname ever listed for her. Suddenly, I see the name Lindqvist. But, but what does that mean? They now live like 70 miles away from Bjurholm and where she was raised. Um, why Lindqvist? So I did some more digging. And in looking at all the 14 household examination records, this is what I see. From birth up until the time when Hatshepsut was married. So between April 1883 and November of 1883, what we see is a, Anna Erika Eriksdottir, the mother, living on Bredträsk. This is the farm where she was living when the baby was conceived. Then, when the mother is about 7 months pregnant, she moves over to a different farm that is owned by another farmer whose last name is Sjöberg over in Stanäs. Now, it seems a little odd, but perhaps Jonsson, the owner of the farm in Bredträsk, didn't want one of his workers to divide her time between, the work that should be done that she's being paid for and taking care of a newborn. I don't know what happened there. But what I see is that at 7 months pregnant, she moves over to Stanäs and is now working for a guy whose last name is Sjöberg. From there, we see that, sorry, there we go. From there, we see that Anna Erika moves or goes from Stanäs up to Fredrika, where she gives birth. And she probably went there before the birth, I would assume. Unfortunately, the records were don't actually show where the birth took place in the parish of Fredrika. This wasn't an official move. So in the moving in and out columns of the household examination records, it doesn't say anything about what household she stayed with. But what we do know is that she was there in January 1884 when the baby was born, seemed to stay there during the recovery, and then went back to her employer in Stanäs um, after absolution of sins, or at least that's what it would say. So from there, it's interesting because the baby at about 10 months old stays on the Sjöberg farm, but the mother starts working on a different farm, not far from Stanäs, and the last name of that family is Thorén. Now, it seems kind of odd to me that the mother would, be going over to a different farm to work. But on the other hand, the baby is still small. At about 10 months old, they're introducing solid foods. It would be easier for the mother to be able to go over and work at a different location. Maybe she was paid more, whatever the reason. Or maybe the Shrewberries just loved having this infant around, or this, eventually toddler, right? Anyway, mom is working over here on the Korean farm. And then what we see about a year later is that the baby moves over there as well in November of 1885. So at this point, the child is about 22 months old and, had different needs as life changed, all that kind of stuff. And so at that point, both the mother and the daughter are living on the Korean farm, and they stay there for about 4 years. And then finally, they leave um, down to Arnes, which is 67 US miles away. And still, we don't know why. Like, these records show locations, which is really helpful and good to know, but it doesn't give us the reasons of what the whys, right? Of the 19 records that I looked at, one of them stood out to me. While the mother and the daughter are living on the farm in Björholm, on the Torén farm, it's interesting because the landowner up here is this Anders Gustav Torén, and he's listed here with his wife and some children. One of his children is this Anders Sven Torén, and he's married. He has a wife who, interestingly, is also named Anna Erika Eriksdotter, and they have a couple of children. And then my Anna Erika Eriksdotter is down here at the bottom. And here we see her child born out of wedlock, Augusta Elisabeth. There's no note out here regarding who the said father is. Now, it seems a little odd because we've got this mark out here to the left. And this mark is next to Anna Erika's name. And the corresponding mark is next to Anders Sven Thorén's name. But what does it mean? There's no explanation as to what it means. The other odd thing is that the mother is his wife. Here's Anna Erika Eriksdotter. This woman down here is Anna Erika Eriksdotter. So did the pastor get confused? If this had been other circumstances, I would have thought that this Anna Erika down here had been working on this farm, and then eventually one of the family members there married her, right? And so then I, at first glance, assumed that this Anna Erika Eriksdotter is the same Anna Erika Eriksdotter up here. But when you look at their birth years, one of them is born in 1859 and the other is born in 1861. So interesting, but there's no proof of paternity here. And we don't know if this was just like some confusion by the pastor. Once they moved to Arnes, then they moved to a farm called Utanlandsjö. And the owner of that farm, his name is Christopher Lindqvist. And then they moved to another farm called Stubismark. And in Stubismark, they stay there. They end up, for the next 10 years, they end up working for these different households. Her mother still has not married. She's just helping with all the work that needs to be done at the home farm. And her daughters, they're just living with her. And they move from farm to farm. And then they end up with Niels Lundqvist. Now, at some point, Niels Lundqvist died. And so at that point, the mother, Augusta Elisabeth, I'm sorry, Anna Erika, and her daughter, Augusta Elisabeth, separate ways. Augusta Elisabeth is only 14 years old, but for some reason, she goes back to the original employer that they had moved to 10 years previous and lives in that household. And when she's confirmed, she takes the name Lindqvist. Now, I have to tell you just a little bit about surnames in Sweden. They don't have the same cultural reference that we have in the US or British centric cultures. Their last names could change at any time. So that's going to present some problems when we start looking at DNA data, because you have to be open-minded to the last name being whatever. In this case, Augusta Elisabeth has taken the name Lindqvist, and at this point, I don't know if there's a relationship or not, but it seems odd that she just takes the name of her employer. Meanwhile, the mother goes off to a different farm, and the two of them, from then on, never live together again. So it's this interesting story. Augusta Elisabeth stays with the Lindqvist family until she then moves away to a city not far away in 1910, and then she eventually marries. So in looking at all these records, 19 different records, there's lots of data to work with here. There's lots of details that tell us where the mother was when the baby was conceived and where they moved to. And there's this interesting story that's going on. And the mother going to a different parish for the birth. But there's no evidence that is telling us who the said to be father is. And this is where it sat for decades. We just didn't know until DNA came along. And when DNA came along, we realized this is a great opportunity to use DNA to find out who her father is.
Hey,
So,
Jeff.
yes.
I don't know if it's possible to fix this, but there's a couple people saying the audio is just a little bit garbled. So,
Um, I don't know why. Do you hear me okay, Tanner?
yeah, I can understand you.
Okay, but understand and hear are two different things. Are you hearing me okay? Like,
Yes.
am I clear to you? Because
Yeah.
I don't know on whose end what the problem is. If other people are hearing me okay, then it might be a problem on their system or their internet connection.
Okay.
Um, I'm not using Wi-Fi. I'm connected to an Ethernet line, so my
Mhm.
internet is stable,
Okay.
and I'm using headphones. So that's
Okay.
where the problem is. Sorry.
Okay.
Maybe I should slow down, but we could do that. I'll try that. Let's see how that goes. So this this research problem is uh, a great opportunity to use DNA. You know, we don't know who the father is because of all the records that I've been talking about. It would seem that Anna Erika chose to hide the father's name. That was a legal right in Sweden between 1778 and 1917. There's no patronymic surname for Augusta Elisabeth from the time of her birth until she's confirmed at 14 years old. So perhaps, if we had had a patronymic name, it would have at least given us a clue on the first name of her father. But in this case, none of the records show a patronymic name. Between 14 and 31 years old, she uses the name Lindqvist until she married in 1915 and then took her husband's. This is a great opportunity for DNA because the genealogical goal in this case is to find an unknown father. Now, normally you would be able to use Y-DNA, but in this case, it doesn't go through a son, it goes through a daughter. Now, if Anna Erika had had more than one child out of wedlock, which she did, by the way, and one of them was a son, maybe it's the same father. So that's one hypothesis that could be explored. This is my mother's grandmother who was born out of wedlock. And so in this case, there's many living descendants of Augusta Elisabeth that are within 5 or 6 generations of the genealogical goal. The genealogical goal here is 4 generations from my mother, 5 generations from me. So in either way, it's within the scope, which is the limit for autosomal DNA to solve genealogical problems. When I started the DNA process, I decided to start with the DNA test for my mother, and then she has a full brother, and then she also has a half sister and some first cousins that we're willing to test. And all of these people are within 4 generations, but they're the 4th generation from the unknown father. The records, as I've shared, are very rich in Sweden, lots of genealogical information. So I have a lot of data to try to analyze the DNA findings uh, based on what the records show me. And then we've done extensive research on all the other ancestral lines. This is the only line in our family tree that has not been thoroughly researched and documented. So with all this said, I had a great foundation to start using DNA to try to find my father. So I started by testing the oldest living descendants of the unknown father. And in this case, it was my mother, her brother, and half sister. When I did that, I found, my mother was born in Sweden. She immigrated to the United States when she was 22 years old. Her brother never left Sweden. I started by doing tests with Ancestry for them. But when I used the filter to see how many matches that my mother had with people who live in Sweden, there were only 107 for my mother. And when I did the test with her brother, who is a Swede living in Sweden, there were only 198 matches with people who live in Sweden. Then I found out that my heritage does a lot of marketing in Sweden and for whatever reason is more popular for people to be doing their DNA testing with. And when I downloaded their data from Ancestry, which you can do for free, and uploaded the data to my heritage, which you can also do for free, I found that my mother had over 11,000 matches with people who live in Sweden, and her brother had over 14,000 matches with people in Sweden. At that point, I just stopped testing anybody else with Ancestry. I reached out to my mother's half sister, who also descends from the unknown father, and I was able to then look at some shared matches there, just using their auto cluster tool and other tools that they offer to find, and found that they have over 5,000 matches in common. I'm sorry, 8,000 of shared matches. I also tested or invited to test a couple of cousins, first cousins to my mom, and those tests have not come back yet. So then I decided while I'm waiting for those results to come in, I decided to start researching all the living descendants of the genealogical goal. There's fantastic resources for Sweden. They have published a 1940, actually all these years of census right up to the year 2000 are available and searchable. And so you can easily follow people through the records right down to the year 2000. And the death records are published online and it's right up to 2022. So there's fantastic resources to find living descendants. I also looked in online directories and then, of course, social media to try to find these living descendants and reach out to them. This is what I found. So we have Anna Erika here, who's born in 1859. Here's the unknown father. I know that Anna Erika had two children, Augusta Elisabeth and Johann Evert. Granted, Augusta Elisabeth was born in Bjurholm and Johann Evert was born in Arnäs, which is like 70 miles away. So it seems unlikely that they share the same father, but I don't know that yet until I do the DNA testing, right? Then I started looking at all of their descendants, and what I found was that after Augusta Elisabeth married, she married this Erik Olof Fröberg, and they had four children. And then, so these are an aunt and uncles to my mother. And then Augusta Elisabeth had a couple children out of wedlock before she married as well. And interestingly, she named one of her sons before she married Carl Alfred Christopher Lindqvist, which was the name of her employer back in Arnhem. And so, anyway, it's all interesting as I continue to research. I find that the children she had had before wedlock, she only had one. The first child, Emma Merta, only had one child. And then Frida, Karl Bertil, Erik Olof, and Johann Hilding, they all had families of different sizes. And then when I explored even further to look at the grandchildren of this generation, in other words, the ones who would be first cousins, right, at that level, then I see that Karl Bertil had the largest family, and that's the family I descend from. And then all my mom's first cousins are all here on this row. So by doing this, I found out that Y-DNA is not going to be an option, right? Because um, what I did find out is that Everett, he only had one child, and that child never married and has died. So there's no option of doing a Y test to be able to see if maybe it's the same father. That said, then I switched over to my autosomal test and started just focusing on, you know, my mother, her brother, and half sister's DNA results, and then one son from Frida who was willing to test, as well as one son from Von Hildings who was willing to test. And then this one is still pending as well. Now, because I had done all of these tests, then on my heritage, I could use my heritage DNA tools to try to start figuring out even more. And so I love the auto cluster tool on my heritage. So, in Ancestry, when you have your DNA matches, really you have to just look at the shared matches over and over and over, and then start using labels and colors to create clusters. And then you can create spreadsheets of just creating this process of clustering, finding these groups who are related to each other. Well, my heritage does that for you. They have this great auto cluster tool. And what you have here up at the top left is a list of all the DNA matches down the left side. I've covered their name for privacy. You have an identical list across the top. And then what the system does is it looks at sequences of numbers to then group those who share the same SNPs or the same sequences, right? And then it assigns a color. And so each of these colored boxes going diagonally across the chart represent different familial lines. Now, as I was going through the DNA match list, you know, yes, I can look for surnames, but as I mentioned earlier, that you run into problems with that in Sweden because people can change their surnames at any time for a good reason or for no reason. And people still change their surnames today. Um, they just have a different cultural view towards surnames than we do. But I did go through the ones that did have linked trees and looking at their trees to then try to look for, places and possible connections. When the half sister results came in, I then started. So in this case, the half sister and my mother and brother all share the same father but different mothers. So that actually helped me narrow down the descendants of this unknown great grandfather. And but I still wasn't really seeing a pattern. And there were still just so many questions. Are they related to the Lindqvist or the Lundqvist? That's kind of might be a variant of the same name. You'd wonder. I had already explored Johan Everett, but then no, he didn't go by Eriksson. So it would seem because he used a pattern name. It would seem that I'm sorry, he used Eriksson, and so then that led me wondering if they might be related somehow. And then Augusta Elisabeth's born in '84, but Johan Everett was born in '89. When I went back and looked at the records again, I saw this strange mark again. And I thought, you know what? I have an unknown, I'm sorry, I've got a non-patronymic name, Turian, that I could just run a search for. And so as I started running some searches for that in my heritage, by reevaluating the records, I found that my uncle had a match to a Turian and that they shared, I mean, literally a 100 centimorgan match between my uncle and this Niels Turin. And that Niels Turin, who was in his 90s when he took this test, with a 100 centimorgan match, it was just uh, really surprising that I would have him that high. And when I went to the tree, I found that there's this Katarina Erika Turin, and that she's the daughter of an Anders Gustav Turin. I recognize those names from my research and what I'd seen in the records. And when I went back to the records in Bjurholm, I find it's the same Anders Gustav Turin up here at the top. Katarina Erika is actually one of the sisters of Anders Sven Turin. And so it would seem that the pastor had knowledge that Anders Sven was actually the father of Anna Erika. But because he was legally restricted from writing that note over in comments, he just made this little mark. But DNA proved it. So with that knowledge, I went back and looked at the DNA results of other matches. I found that there were lots of matches with people who have uh, over 15 centimorgans, right? Because when you hit the 15 centimorgan level, then if it's smaller than 15 centimorgans, it could be a false positive. So, so I've got lots of DNA matches. This Nils was 100 centimorgans, but there's lots of other ones that have, you know, 40, 50, 60 or more centimorgans. So it's definitely confirming, the research based to prove the paternity of Anders Sventorian here. So the proof of paternity is because the DNA matches were within 5 generations. There are 46 DNA matches ranging from 100 centimorgans down to 15.2 to the Turine family. The DNA matches have appropriate centimorgan value and relationships to the mother, to my mother, her brother, and half sister. And then Anders Sventorian is one of 4 siblings, 2 boys and 2 girls, and his brother died. So he's the only son of this generation. And so between that and the mark, everything just lined up. What I see with this knowledge then is that Anna, Erica, and Anders Sven were living on neighboring farms at the time of conception. So we have proximity. The mark out to the left of the household was unique to them on the page. And as I looked on other pages in the record, I wasn't seeing that mark being used elsewhere. So it seemed, very intentional, but no explanation. And then, of course, all the other lines on mom's side have been thoroughly researched and sourced. So this is the only place where the Turian family would fit. And so with this, we have a solid conclusion. It's unknown if Anders Sven's wife had knowledge of this paternity to Augusta Elisabeth. It may have been that when Augusta Elisabeth was 10 months old and the mother goes to work over on the same farm as Anders Sven, that perhaps Anders Sven and the mother had a secret agreement that she would be employed and supported instead of the mother coming to him asking for child support. They perhaps just came up with this agreement to hide it because it was a case of adultery, which would have been um, a, very, well, it's a shame and it shameful for the family in culture at the time. And so basically, um, it might have just been a secret arrangement to provide child support. And then Anna, Erica, and Augusta, Elisabeth, they move away, when the child is about 4 years old. They move pretty far away. I mean, considering the transportation at the time, almost 70 miles away in northern Sweden. And so, perhaps that's because of this, the mother was asking for money, or maybe the wife found out. Whatever the case, they abruptly leave and they leave like almost 70 miles. So, what about the Lindqvist? Well, Lindqvist seems to be a name that she just took uh, at the time of confirmation and continued to use until she married. It must have been someone who she thought highly of. And so she took the name, but there's no relationship to the Lindqvists in Arnäs to Anders Sventorian. So, so the DNA evidence and records all support the same conclusion. The key learnings from this case study would be that you really need to get the oldest living descendants to test. If there's Y-DNA as an option based on a genealogical problem, then use Y to try to solve that problem. If the goal is in Sweden or in Europe for that matter, in many countries in Europe, not all, but in many countries in Europe, you're going to want to test with MyHeritage. And centimorgan values that are over 15 are solid, although arguably, depending on the length of the SNPs, you might question some of those that are still very low. But as a general rule, 15 is considered solid, and under 15 might be a false positive. So don't make geological conclusions based on centimorgan values that are under 15. Like they're interesting to go back and look at after the fact, after you've made your conclusion. You can see that there's traces of that DNA showing up with even under 15. But I wouldn't use any centimorgan values under 15 to try to conclusion. And then there's fantastic resources to find living descendants in Sweden. You know, uh, you're going to want to try to get DNA results for each line that descends from the unknown father. You can use social media to try to reach out to these people who have not tested. Um, Thankfully, in Sweden, tons of people are using many different platforms. And then if you're doing a research problem in Sweden, you just got to be aware of those naming customs that can complicate searching your match list because you really can't do that just off the surname alone, or at least not put so much weight onto the surname. And then you really need to search the records thoroughly. And even after you've searched the records thoroughly, you really need to reevaluate the evidence in the records. So, with that, well, I think we have just a few minutes for any questions. Tanner, were there any questions that came in?
Yeah, there's a couple. Thank you again for that great presentation. Um, Tania said, did you use any other DNA companies for this search?
No. So in other words, I didn't use, I have moved the data over to family tree DNA. I even moved, so meaning I moved the autosomal test from Ancestry to family tree DNA. But their testing pool is significantly smaller than my heritage, and so I didn't find any meaningful hits there. So, so the only companies involved were Ancestry, my heritage, and family tree DNA for autosomal testing.
Okay. Um, let's see. So Roseanne on YouTube says, how do you use DNA if you have no trees to connect to your relative?
Yeah, that's going to be really hard because whenever you're going through a DNA match list, one of the first things you're doing, aside from looking at surnames, assuming it's not in Sweden, um, but you're looking at surnames, dates, and places to try to look for possible proximity to solve a problem. But until you have a tree, you're really up against some major problems. It really depends on what your genealogical goal is. But even when I've helped people with consultations and they're just trying to find an unknown father or an unknown mother, you still have to use records. And the information you see in records, you then organize into trees. So if a DNA match doesn't have a tree, you all you can do is message them and ask them what they know about their family.
Yep. Um, there's a question on Facebook. Lori says, how do you find orphanage records? Um, yeah, I
There are
guess depends.
yeah, there are orphanage records in Sweden, and there was a large public orphanage in Stockholm, and they have very good records. And so I would look in the Family Search Wiki for whatever country you're working in, and then try the catalog, Family Search catalog, to see if there's anything under the topic of orphanage for that locality you're working in. And if that doesn't work, I'd reach out to the archives.
Awesome. Um, did you look at deaths for any Linkfist in for the period of time of a male that she would claim paternity that couldn't be argued because the guy was dead?
Yes, I did, uh, but they were all dead ends. It was just a lot of negative results because nothing ended up pointing to or connecting in the records to be able to tie a relationship to Christopher Linkfist, the employer. So I explored Linkfist for a while, and so did my mother, but it never led to anything because that's not where the answer was found. It was misleading.
Um, okay, Ellen on Zoom says, so should I understand that this process will not work if the missing father is 7 generations back?
It depends, but you could still use Y-DNA. But if you use Y-DNA in that situation, you'll probably end up needing to do some target testing, meaning you would find a direct paternal descendant to take a Y test, and then you would do research to find a potential male descendant of that same common ancestor and invite them to test. But for autosomal, it's outside the range of 5 generations. So you're stuck unless you use a Y.
Yeah. Um, Kathy on Zoom says, with DNA matches, whose trees may have only a few names, is it possible, or if possible, is it worth my time to do the research and build trees for these matches?
Yes, it is. We often refer to those as quick and dirty trees, but basically we just use databases to try to collect low-hanging fruit, if you want to say, uh, in building someone's tree to an extent that hopefully the systems, whether it's family search or ancestry or MyHeritage, is bringing record hints or possible matches to help build that tree. It's tricky when you're dealing with living people. So it depends on what your genealogical goal is. If it's to, just find an unknown father or mother, you're running into a lot of privacy restrictions. But if it's further back in time, like finding an unknown grandparent or even a great grandparent, you definitely want to be building trees for those who don't, and and then trying. But again, you'd only invest your time where you thought there was a good hypothesis. So if you have a good hypothesis, yes, you there's times where you end up doing the research to try to understand what looks like when they don't have a tree attached to their data.
At 11:15, one of our classes today is actually be how to build quick trees. And so stay tuned for that one. It's going to be all about this topic. Um, Pamela on Zoom says, is the Y-DNA only for males?
Yes, it's only looking at one chromosome, the Y chromosome, which is the sex chromosome for males. And then, of course, you'd have the X for the mitochondrial uh, sex chromosome for females. Um, so yeah, if you're researching a male and trying to, find paternity, and the great thing about Y is that you can go way beyond 5 generations in further back, but that also brings up.
Awesome. Wendy on Facebook says, does the absolution involve paying fines, and would there be records of them?
Great question. The answer is yes. There would have been a fee or fine that would have been paid to the church, and probably was a small fine, but still. Um, and then by the time Augusta Elisabeth was born in 1884, they had decriminalized having children out of wedlock. So in Sweden, so uh, that would be the only fee that she would have paid, and the absolution of sins would have been a private meeting with the pastor. So that would not have involved any public humiliation.
Awesome. Let's see. I think we got all the questions. Let me just double check. Yeah, I am okay. One more that just came in. By the way, if anyone has any questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. But Laura on Zoom says, oh, I have followed my DNA genealogy to Western Poland, but my ethnicity through Ancestry says I'm 33% Swedish. So why is there this discrepancy?
So ethnicity is an interesting question. A lot of people take DNA tests just for ethnicity. They want to know how much of their ancestry comes from different countries. But you have to be careful with your conclusions with that because it's determined by the testing pool. And in this case, you could have people who, were from Sweden, but whose ancestors were actually from Poland. I mean, Europe really is a melting pot. And so you can have people in Sweden whose ancestry came up from Poland, or vice versa, where you have people from Sweden who went down to Poland. And for a while in northern Poland, there was an area that was actually conquered by the Swedes for a short time, but there were colonies. And so there were people in northern Poland who were Swedish. Maybe one of those.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. To the people who asked, yes, this is being recorded. So we're streaming to Facebook right now, and that's on our Family Search Library Facebook page. That is where the recording is going to be like immediately. And then in the next little bit, it's going to end up on our Roots Tech page. So thank you so much to Jeff for that wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed when I watched him solve it in like real time. Like when I first was hired on, it wasn't solved yet. And so it's been really fun to watch him go through this process. Our next presentation is going to be at 10 o'clock. So just in 2 minutes. It's going to be DNA Basics, an Introduction to DNA and Genealogy by Beth Taylor. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys the link to the handout for this next class real quick.